I mentioned at the beginning of our series on this question of abortion that our nation has been torn at its very heart, and that the intensity of the debate, the public debate over abortion, has increased. The stridency level has been augmented. And I say that what happens when we have public debates like this and people march and protest is as they march, they will bear signs, and on those signs they will present slogans that are visible for people to see. In the public issue, they don't have time in the public arena to go through carefully reasoned arguments to support one side or the other, and so we try to do it through a kind of shorthand, where we take our sign and we scribble a little phrase across it, give me liberty or give me death, don't tread on me. It's an American tradition. Now, of course, it's been rapidly being replaced by bumper stickers and things of that sort. And, you know, there's some very clever bumper stickers. I can't pass up a bumper sticker without reading it and see how succinctly someone has been able to capture a fertile idea. But that's one of the disadvantages when we're trying to get a careful, sober evaluation of an issue as important as this one is, when sometimes we have to deal strictly with these shorthand, abbreviated slogans and the like. But one that defends abortion is one that I see on bumper stickers, I see on protester signs, and I've read in the newspaper again and again and heard it articulated by pro-abortion advocates on television. And it's one with which we're very familiar, and that is the statement that every woman has a right to her own body. Let me state it again. Every woman has a right to her own body. That's the premise. Then, of course, therefore, no other person, the state or the husband or anyone else, has the right to tell her what to do with this baby that is developing within her. It's within her body. Men do not carry babies from conception to birth. That has been the work of women. And it's a point that some people are very distressed about. But again, the premise is every woman has a right to her own body. First, let's define what kind of a proposition that is. It is what we call a universal affirmative. That is, a positive proposition or assertion is being assigned to all individuals within a particular class. In this case, every woman. That's the universality of it. Every woman has the right to her own body. Now, there are three things about this principle that is quoted frequently as a universal proposition, affirmative proposition, that I struggle with. The first is sometimes I'm not sure what people are meaning when they use the word right in that proposition. We know that, again, there's another fallacy of logic that is one of the most frequently committed fallacies there is, which is called the fallacy of equivocation. And basically what happens in the fallacy of equivocation is that in the course of the discussion or of the argument, sometimes very subtly, the meaning of a word changes. Now, I'm not saying that pro-abortionists are doing that with this case, but how the phrase is understood and perceived is a little bit confusing because of the different way in which we can understand the meaning of the word right. We tend to use the term right when we talk about rights in two distinct ways. We may and must distinguish between legal rights, that is, those actions or activities that are protected by and sanctioned by the government. But we also speak about moral or ethical rights. And I think we will agree that it has happened in many governments, if not all governments in the history of the world, that governments will make mistakes ethically with respect to what they sanction at a given time. That is, a government may give the legal right to people to do something that is morally wrong. That is, we may have a legal right to do something that is morally and ethically wrong. So I asked myself, how is the phrase, a woman has a right, every woman has a right to her own body, how is the word right being used in that phrase? Now, if what people are saying is, look, we're having a debate about whether or not it is proper for the government of the United States to regulate abortion, to outlaw abortion. There are people who are saying Roe versus Wade should be stricken down, that it is as dreadful as the Dred Scott decision was earlier in the history of our country. It was a shameful decision by the Supreme Court. I hope, all recognize that now. And so every year we're debating whether or not the rules governing abortion should be changed. Now, if someone is arguing that we ought not to change the law on abortion because every woman has the right, that is, the legal right, to her own body. And then I would say, well, where do you get the legal right to your own body? And they say, well, from Roe versus Wade. Now, do you see the circularity of using the argument in that way? Right now, presently, the woman does have the right to her own body with respect to her unborn children. And so we're saying, therefore, she should continue to have the right because she already has the right. That is the legal right. Now, the only way that could be a legitimate, valid argument would be if the unstated premise were this, that any law that is already in effect should always remain in effect. But I don't think anybody's arguing that kind of a universal position. But ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that's what people mean when they say that every woman has a right to her own body. I don't think people are just simply arguing now in a vicious circle and say we have the legal right, therefore everyone should continue to have the legal right because you already have it. That's a vicious, hopeless circular argument, obviously. Something much more profound is being articulated in that argument. I think what people mean, although I don't have an opportunity to question everyone who makes this argument, that every woman has a right to her own body. I think what they mean by that is that every single woman in the world has the moral and ethical right to her own body. In other words, I think people are arguing ethically here, not legally. They're arguing for a legal position from an ethical basis. They say we should have the legal right because we have the ethical right, and if it is the task of government, as we've already seen, to promote justice, and if my ethical right is there, it would be unjust for the state to deny me that ethical right. Now, the argument is consistent, and the argument is not vicious or circular. The argument in this sense would be, ladies and gentlemen, a valid argument. Now be careful. An argument can be valid and its conclusion can be false. When we say an argument is valid, all we mean by that is that the conclusion flows necessarily from the premises. The premises may be false. But if the conclusion follows inevitably from the premises, then the argument is what we would say valid. It doesn't say anything about its truthfulness. Now, I have some questions about the premise that every woman has a moral right or ethical right to her own body with respect to abortion. My first question is very simple. Where does that moral right come from? What is the ethical foundation for the claim that I or a woman or anybody else has a moral right to anything? Who is the author of moral rights? Where do we appeal? To natural law? Does natural law reveal an inalienable right to abortion? Certainly, the history of the jus gentium, the laws of the nations, would gainsay that. Certainly, natural law, as we've already seen, would gainsay that. Or perhaps one is saying is that God is the author of my ultimate moral right to have an abortion. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't always have time in these short, brief sessions to go over every premise in the care with which I would like to do it. And sometimes it's just exercise the prerogative of the theologian and be dogmatic. But for the sake of brevity and shorthand, let me just speak personally for a second. That I am a theologian. Theologians are not infallible. Obviously, theologians make all kinds of mistakes, even within their own field. A person can be a professional theologian and not know really a whole lot about God. And I'm a professional theologian. It's been the study of my life. I want to say this clearly, for what it's worth to you. If I know anything about the character of God, I know that God hates abortion. And nothing is more foreign to his character than to maintain that God Almighty grants an inalienable right to any woman to have an abortion. That is not true. I'm not saying that people are saying God gives them the right. They're not telling me where they're getting the right. But I know they're not getting it from God. And if we think that we're getting it from God, I'm afraid we may be seriously deceiving ourselves. The next question I have with respect to the argument or the premise, every woman has a right to her own body with respect to abortion, is this one. Is this right to your own body? And I may want to hasten to add that I believe that women do have all kinds of ethical rights to their own body. They have a moral and ethical right to be protected from an assault against their body. They have a moral and ethical right to be protected against the violence and the humiliation of rape. No man, I'll give you a universal negative, no man ever has a right to rape a woman. That is a gross and heinous crime against another human being. And every woman, conversely, has the moral right to be defended and protected from that sort of thing. We have other rights to our own body. I mean, we sometimes, when we check into hospitals to undergo the care there, we sort of feel like we're in custody, and that if we don't like what's going on, we have to suffer it in silence and endure it. But actually, you do have a right to get up out of the bed and say, I've had all of this care I want, I'm leaving. You know, we tend to forget that this is a business transaction that we're involved in here, that we're not under arrest when we go to the hospital. And a woman certainly has the right to determine to some degree how she's being treated in medical facilities and so on. There are no arguments about that. But my question is this: is a woman's right to her own body, and this is the crucial point, is it an absolute right? Is it an unlimited right? Or are there other principles and rights that impose limits and restraints upon whatever right we have to our own bodies? From a biblical theological society, we know, for example, that in Old Testament Israel, in the legislation that God gave to his people, he prohibited self-mutilation of the human body, of both male and female. Other nations and people go into certain cultic practices where they do violence to their own flesh and deform their own bodies and for various reasons. That was prohibited in Old Testament Israel. So at least in that case, we know on occasion where restraints were placed upon what person's rights were with respect to their own bodies. The moral issues surrounding the question of suicide touch on this position. Do I have the moral right, for example, to destroy my own body? There are many states, I believe to this day, and certainly nations, that pass civil laws disallowing suicide. I don't know how they impose punishments upon those who succeed, but it is against the law, so that if you try it and you don't succeed, you can certainly be called in and be paying penalties for it. Because the state recognizes that we don't have the right to destroy ourselves. One of the most poignant things that we find in biblical history are to find those people who are suffering severe persecution in heroic measure, who are begging God for permission to die. Moses asked God to kill him. Job asked God to kill him, to put him out of his misery, and so on. But they were not given the right to suicide. And obviously, my individual rights of my body are limited always by your rights of your own body. For example, a professional boxer's fists are part of his own body, and they are considered by the law to be weapons, lethal weapons. Now, my fists are not registered as lethal weapons, okay? But I do not have the right of my own body to use my body as a weapon to injure your body. That's one restraint on the rights of my body. I can't use it to harm you. But then there's one other question with this repeated position that I think is important. And that is one that goes on every day. The debate is the unborn child, technically speaking, really a part of the mother's body? It's obvious, isn't it, that in a normal pregnancy, the unborn child is in the mother's body. So that here we have a woman who has something going on inside of her. Now, there's no dispute that embryo, fetus, whatever you want to call it, that baby that is developing in there is inside of that woman's body. But is it part of her body simply because it's located within her? We've already demonstrated that fetus, baby, or embryo, whatever you want to call it, has its own distinct and peculiar genetic structure and makeup. For example, if you're following what has been going on in criminal law, that it's only within the last 10 years or so that scientific investigation in the field of genetics had been able to use the genetic code to solve crimes. That there is a method now to establish individual identity that is as certain or more certain than fingerprinting. It's called the genetic fingerprint. That in a piece of hair from your head, a drop of blood from your arm, or from just the tiniest portion of your flesh, a scientist now can isolate the distinctive genetic fingerprint of your identity. Now here's the point I want to make. If you take a tissue sample from an unborn child and examine its genetic structure, its genetic fingerprint will not match the fingerprint of the mother, because it carries the genetic code both of the mother and of the father. And what is growing in there from a biomedical perspective is not part of the woman's body. So I don't want to labor this point any longer, but to simply say that every woman has a right to her own body, therefore she has the right to destroy the developing baby within her, involves some very, very serious questions. Again, the difference between a legal right and a moral right. Again, the principle that my individual rights, even if they are moral rights, are limited and not absolute if they conflict with other individual human rights. And thirdly, there is the strong evidence that the unborn child may not medically and biologically be considered actually a part of the woman's body, other than the fact that it is located for a time within the woman's body. Now, the second principle that we hear frequently in the debate is the argument from the right of individual liberty. Now, this, of course, is closely connected to the one I've just gone over. But it is one that is vital to, and probably the most vital issue of the whole debate of abortion. Quickly, ladies and gentlemen, 20 years ago, I don't know what the percentage of people was in the United States that favored abortion. I'm not talking now about abortion in the case of incest or in about the danger of the loss of the life of the mother, that sort of thing. We're talking now about the issue that's dividing us. Those are special issues that take even more careful consideration, obviously. We're talking now about abortion on demand. 20 years ago, I don't know what the numbers were, but I would guess that probably less than 5%, certainly less than 20% of the people in this country believed that abortion was right. The vast majority of people considered abortion a terrible crime. Now, one wonders how, in the space of 2 decades, public opinion, which of course does not determine the issue, but how public opinion has changed so radically in such a short period of time. 2 things, I think, explain that in the main. The first is, of course, it was legalized. And many people in our nation take their cue in determining what is right by looking and seeing what is legal. If the government says it's okay, it must be okay. And so then you have a whole shift in people's perception of what is permissible and what is not permissible. But ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand that there was a significant, carefully conceived strategy that has been stated publicly. This is not anything I'm making up out of whole cloth. That from those who were advocates of pro-abortion understood that if they were going to lobby for the right of abortion, that they were going to be met by fierce opposition, that they were a very small minority, and it seemed like an impossible task for them ever to change the balance of public opinion. And the strategy that was conceived was this. They said, well, first of all, we know we're going to get opposition from the Roman Catholic Church. How can we neutralize it? And they said, what we have to do is connect the issue of abortion to another issue that the rest of the churches, the mainline Protestant churches, will defend. And what is more American, more sacrosanct in our culture than the right of free choice. It was a masterstroke, an ingenious strategy. They gave people a third alternative. Instead of saying, are you for abortion or against abortion, they said, no, there's a middle ground here, and that is, usually the middle ground is where the majority of the people are. They said, that is pro-choice. The principle being is, everybody ought to have a right to express and exercise their own choice in the matter. Those who don't want to have abortions don't have to have them. Those who do, it's up to them. And how many times we hear people say, I would never have an abortion, but I will defend the right of another person to have it. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, what we're talking about here, that if, I'm convinced it is, but if abortion is murder, that is like saying, I personally wouldn't want to murder anybody, but I'll defend your personal liberty to do it if you like. I mean, that's madness. But the thing that people don't perceive in this debate is that a vote for pro-choice legally is a vote for pro-abortion. You've got to understand that. If you say you're against abortion, but you want to leave it up to the individual, and that's your vote, you have voted to legalize abortion. You have participated in that process. Maybe that's your intent and that's what you're satisfied with, but I want you to understand that the whole balance of power, the swing vote in the whole issue, has been with that group of people in the middle who have taken the stand on what is called pro-choice. That's what swung the pendulum of popular opinion against the protection of the unborn child. Finally, there is the argument of the right to privacy. Obviously, we abhor any thoughts of living in a society such as that envisioned by George Orwell, where people can come in and examine us and look at us and seize us without warrant and so on. There are laws in the Bill of Rights protecting us against unwarranted seizure and so on. And that privacy certainly is a very important commodity. In fact, I'll say something very candidly with you. As a person involved in public ministry, the more times I speak here, there, and everywhere, the more I'm recognized. And over the last 25 years, my personal experience of privacy has diminished like that. And I'll be honest with you, I never knew how precious privacy is, or was, until I lost it. And I haven't lost it like rock stars and professional athletes have. Those poor people can't sit down and have a meal without having their privacy invaded, because when you lose your privacy, you feel like you're losing your humanity. So I am urgently concerned to protect people's privacy. But again, the right to privacy is never absolute, is it? We already have legislation that allows for tax audits, for credit checks, for investigation and search of our home under the protection of a warrant and so on. And I think we all understand this is a simplistic thing, but ladies and gentlemen, I don't have the right to steal as long as I do it in privacy. Nor do I have the right to murder if I do it in privacy. Now, what people are afraid of is that if we begin to regulate by federal law abortions and so on, this comes so close to our sexual behavior that we have this fear of a slippery slide, that this means that the government is going to come in to our bedroom and invade our privacy in our most intimate personal relationships. But to protect human life against unjust destruction does not invade personal privacy, other than to save persons. And that's what the discussion is about. I never have the right, by my personal privacy, to kill you, or you, or you, or any living human person. person.